Many of us have read Jewish books. Some of us have even liked reading Jewish books. Not books we were assigned, books we chose to read. Maybe even authors we decided were our favorite authors, and we read multiple books by them. And reading these books became a kind of Jewish experience. But that all depends on what counts as a Jewish book. So what I want to start with is just to ask you, what have been your favorite Jewish books that you've ever read? And I'm not going to define for you what counts as a Jewish book. If you want to type it in the chat box, that'd be fine. If you prefer to unmute and share a title, that'd be great too. But I just want to start by asking you, what's one of the favorite Jewish books that you've ever read?
Well, I really enjoy Carlo Levi and his writings. Of course, I'm lucky that I can read them in Italian, but it doesn't matter what language you read them in. But Christ Stopped at Eboli is one, and there are several others. And he was also an artist, so he's on top of my list.
Great.
Let's see. I liked The Source by James Minster.
Interesting, not Jewish author,
No.
but about biblical archaeology. So does that count as a Jewish book? We'll see. We'll see.
This is Toby, and don't laugh, but Magtime Murders is one of my favorite Jewish books. The end.
Who's it by?
Anthony Horowitz, who
Okay.
is Jewish. He's written a lot of books, and also his PBS series is on right now. I mean, not this minute, but Sundays.
Right.
You want to
Thanks.
see it.
Okay.
You're welcome. Okay, bye.
Yeah, Judy, please.
This is, I don't even remember when I could have possibly read this, but years and years ago, for some reason, I came across this book we had. It was Hillel's whatever, maybe Happy Holidays or something. It was written by Mamie Gameron, and she wrote about her son. I believe it was her son, Hillel Gameron, and he was the rabbi at Beth Tikva and Hoffman Estates, and that was our first temple as a family. And I've hung on to the book just because that's where we went, but it's a children's book, and I just don't remember the titles she wrote. Maybe it was Hillel's Happy Holidays, but it's a book I just will hang on to. I don't know who's going to read it, but we have it.
I was introduced to My Name is Asher Lev by Chaim Potok as a Sunday school student at Beth Or, and found that both disturbing and wonderful, and have used a variety of his pieces in class. But more recently, haven't really enjoyed Shalom Auslander. I don't know what his real name is because nobody's name is Shalom Auslander. That's just too good. But
Well, I am Rabbi Shalom. Let me.
we are, but Shalom, hello, outsider. But Beware of God and Foreskin's Lament are wonderful. And I have to put a plug in for our Katie Martine, whose name doesn't sound Jewish because it's a pen name. She's Anna Weller, and is the most recent Hugo Award winner for the follow-up to A Memory Called Empire, A Desolation Called Peace, and they're both outstanding.
Despite its subject or topic, I first was introduced to Mouse by Spiegelman in my children's lit course in college, and there are so many layers and things to explore within Mouse and the sequel that I felt like I could have probably had an entire course just on that, not only from the subject matter, but also the use of illustration and art and dialogue and all of those kinds of things from a more literary kind of perspective. So maybe an odd one. It's not exactly happy, but really powerful and intriguing.
Thanks. There's one shared in the chat from Lynn and Elliott Miller, Leon Uris's novel Exodus, about the founding of the State of Israel, Daniel Silva's spy novels, Bruce Feiler's Walking the Bible, and Philip Roth, who's written many books that have been very well received and important. Well, since they're here, I'll mention one that my daughter really appreciated. There's a book series that came out 60, 70 years ago called the All of a Kind Family books. And they were some of the first children's literature that had Jewish families featured in the books. And there's actually a biography of the author of these books that just came out in the last year or two. But what I found wonderful about the experience of my daughter reading the first of these books was that Susan Adelson still had her copies from when she was a kid, and she was Susan Handelsman. And we could tell because she had written her name in the books in her 10-year-old handwriting. And she was able to share those books with us, which we kept for some years as my daughter enjoyed reading them. And then we handed them back off to her for her grandchildren to come. But, that's one of those nice things about wonderful literature, is that it can be handed down from generation to generation in this case, and can be really meaningful. And I see also Roger typed in Bernard Malamud, who has written both short stories and novels, and is one of those sort of canonical American Jewish writers you think of. There's Saul Bellow, there's Bernard Malamud, there's Philip Roth, maybe Henry Roth, who wrote a wonderful novel called Call It Sleep, or Cynthia Ozick is another one that's often talked of in those circles.
Isaac Asimov.
Isaac
What
Asimov as
about
well.
Singer?
Isaac Bashevis Singer, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. You've got wonderful children's literature as well. There's a whole burgeoning field of children's literature now because there's an institution called PJ Library that gives free Jewish books to Jewish families all over the country. And there's also one in Canada and a Hebrew one in Israel. And it's created a whole market for Jewish children's literature and illustrations that are very popular. There's one example right there. I do find it interesting that as we were talking about popular Jewish books, nobody mentioned the Bible or the Torah as our favorite Jewish books. And if someone had, I would have sort of disqualified it anyways, because they're not one book. Remember, there are 24 books in the Hebrew Bible. There's 5 books in the Torah, the first 5. And they also don't have one author. They were written over many times in many places. The Bible is not a book as we think of it in the bound version. It's books. It's an anthology. And so maybe you give credit to the editors that chose the books to go in the anthology, but it's not a case of one authorship, one viewpoint, or one set of stories, or even one kind of literature, because there are beautiful moments to be found in the story of David and Bathsheba on the negative side, or Ruth and Naomi on the positive side. There are wonderful narratives, but it's of uneven quality. Sometimes it seems to our mind repetitive. Sometimes it seems irrelevant to us. Laws that ban the combining of linen and wool into one garment as a standard for ethics seems to us to be not relevant to how you treat other people and how you treat yourself or the natural world. There are stories, there's law, there's what it calls history, which doesn't meet our standards for academic or reliable history. There's the exhortations of the prophets, condemning those who have broken the laws and celebrating those who have kept them in the narrow and true way. You have wisdom literature, proverbs, suggestions for how to live a good life. The challenge with the Torah and the Hebrew Bible more broadly is that it's sort of everything. It's an anthology of Jewish thought from a period of almost 500 years. But just like dinner theater is not great dinner and not great theater, but it's both, the Hebrew Bible sometimes is okay poetry and okay stories, and it's a little bit of everything with some highlights and some lowlights too. But it's not the kind of book that people read cover to cover. Even if they appreciate it as literature, as the first Jewish book, it's certainly not the only Jewish book. Now, I do want to share my favorite Jewish book, or one of my favorite Jewish books. It's a book called The History of Love by Nicole Krauss. The book was originally released in 2005 The audiobook, by the way, is fantastic if you like audiobooks because they have different voices voicing the different characters, and perspective is an important part of the book. So if you like radio plays or that kind of dramatic reading, then the audiobook is fantastic. And in fact, looking up the date of publication, I found out that it was made into a movie in 2016 that reviews say it was terrible and a really bad adaptation. But I love the book so much, I have to watch the movie just to see what violence they did to the story. But what I loved about this book is that it highlights the challenges of defining what Jewish literature is in the 21st century. Because it's a novel in English, so it's not in a Hebrew language. It's not a traditional Jewish form of writing. It's not a Torah commentary or a Haggadah for Passover or a retelling of the Purim story for Purim and a revamped Megillah or a Purim spiel, a play for Purim. It's not in a traditional form. It's not in a traditional Jewish language, but it's an eminently Jewish book in many ways. First of all, there's a Jewish author, and there are Jewish characters grappling with what being Jewish means to them on some level. The events that form the background to the story are both the Holocaust in Europe and the experience of immigration to America. There are arguments about God, and there's also an implicit belief in the book in the power of words to keep people alive. And I would argue that that's a theme of Jewish culture too, the power of words. Remember, in the very first story in our anthology, the creation story, at the very beginning of Genesis, how does God make the world in Genesis chapter 1? He speaks, "Let there be," and there is. So the power of words defines things at the beginning. And even at the end of chapter 1, guess who gets to name all the animals? It's the first human. It's not the animals themselves that choose what they should be called. So Jewish culture historically has been very word-focused, very book-focused. In fact, we've even written many books about how to read other books that we wrote before. So you have volume after volume of Torah commentaries, which is simply a book about how to read that other book. Or you have the Talmud, which in some passages is commentary on the Torah, but also is its own collection of law and legend. And guess what? There are whole volumes of Talmud commentaries helping to explain what that other book had to say about that other book. So it's books upon books upon books. Now, there have definitely been Jewish graphic art, Jewish music, Jewish architecture, lots of other creativity and creative outlets for Jewish life. But books and words especially are number one. Now, in the Middle Ages, there was no question of what counted as a Jewish book. And so I've listed here 6 features of Jewish books that they all had in common, I would say, in the Middle Ages, but they may not have in common today. And so what we're going to do is talk through these criteria and get a sense of what are the most important pieces for defining what a Jewish book would be today and tomorrow. So the first, again, in the Middle Ages, they had all of these criteria. They were written by Jewish authors. They were in a Jewish language. They were aimed at a Jewish audience. They had Jewish cultural and religious or Jewish historical references. Jewish characters were involved in them. They were related directly to Jewish life. They were talking about Jewish identity, religious Jewish practice, Jewish beliefs. And finally, they were accepted as Jewish by Jewish communities. You had a defined Jewish community. You had a defined canon of what they accepted in their world. And so these medieval Jewish books that you might have read in medieval Spain or in Poland or in North Africa, they all had these characters in common: Jewish authorship, language, audience, Jewish content in references and characters, directly addressed to Jewish life, and accepted as Jewish by Jewish communities. These 6 criteria would have applied to a Passover Haggadah, to a Torah commentary, to the religious poetry added to the prayer book over centuries, to the tales of Hasidic rabbis and either their deeds or their sayings, to Spanish Hebrew poetry, even though it was modeled on Arabic models in the early Middle Ages, nevertheless, the contents, the references were Jewish. If they were citing a primary source, it wasn't the Quran, it was the Hebrew Bible. Even a late medieval work called the Sena Urena, which means go out and see, it was a sort of interpretive version of the Bible written for women because it was in Yiddish, or written in Yiddish because it was intended for women, and women were not generally literate in Hebrew in that time and place. These all would have had all of these criteria: authorship, language, audience, content, subject matter, what it's oriented towards, and accepted as Jewish. But when we look forward to the future of American Jewish books, the prospects for these criteria may not be as clear, because it's not as clear how universal they are anymore. So what we're going to do is go backwards up the list from 6 down to 1, and we'll talk about whether each of these is still essential for a book to be defined as a Jewish book today. So number 6, accepted as Jewish by Jewish communities. Well, if you looked at the reading list of a humanistic Jewish community and an ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, there would be almost no overlap other than maybe the Torah and a few passages from the Talmud. But even what we meant by reading those things would be radically different. There are still Jewish book fairs in the world. There is still a national organization called the Jewish Book Council. There's even a quarterly publication called the Jewish Review of Books. It tends to slant a little bit more right-wing, more religious than I might prefer, but it still is a credible attempting an umbrella approach to American Jewish and world Jewish literature, because they review books in other languages and from other parts of the Jewish world too. But the reality is, we are living in a time of fragmentation for culture. You have audiences fragmented into many different interest areas and denominations. You have the multiplication of media. Even if Twitter is really dead, there will still be plenty of other places to go. That means less reading, and that means less consensus on what people are reading. I mean, if nothing else, the advent of self-publishing means the volume of material that's out there has just grown exponentially. And blogs and video YouTube channels and audio podcasts, the content of Jewish cultural creativity is exploding, and there's no way to keep up with it all. Not to mention the fact that Jewish communal divisions mean that sometimes, there's the joke of, this is my synagogue and this is the synagogue I wouldn't set foot in. Well, now it's, this is my Jewish library and this is the Jewish library where I'll never read a single book. And every corner of the Jewish world has both libraries. They've got the one they use and the one they never look at. I mean, it's hard enough having a sense of common culture before you've even added streaming video. I would bet that people saying, have you seen X, is much more common today than have you read X? Because we're simply watching TV more than we're reading, certainly more than we used to. When there were 3 channels and nothing on, and then there were 300 channels and nothing on, but now there's streaming and there's always something on. Well, that's going to be a challenge for having a unified sense of American Jewish literature. So let me ask you, how essential is it for a book to be considered a Jewish book that it be accepted as Jewish by Jewish communities?
I'll say
Mhm.
that I don't think it's particularly important because as somebody who does a lot of writing, you're not always doing it for the audience, you're doing it for yourself. So if it's by the Jewish author about the Jewish experience, that may be just enough. And if the Jewish community doesn't embrace it, is sort of not all that important, in my opinion.
Okay. Cindy.
There are a couple of Black Jewish social media accounts, I guess, that I follow in a few different spaces. And one of them is a writer named Michael W. Twitty. And he recently wrote a book called Kosher Soul. And it's very specifically about his experiences and recipes and things like that with being Black, with being Jewish, and the amount of hatred that he gets from people who question his authenticity and his intentions and his truth and his experience is really astounding, that a book that is so, I think, so deeply Jewish is so easy for folks to dismiss, presumably and kind of obviously because he's Black. And so I think that there's probably space for people in a community to say, no, we don't want that book to represent me or us. But at the same time, to say just to somebody that, you know, we don't allow you to have your identity is a problem.
Mhm. Yeah, Joyce and Rich?
I'm easy. I put any of these categories to me as Jewish. Actually, I'm reading a book right now that I think is Jewish. It doesn't fit any of these. It's a biography of a Jewish man. Most of his life was not comfortable being Jewish, but it attracted me, the topic, the man, and that he was Jewish. So for me, any Jewish tie is a factor in my choosing it, and therefore for me it's a Jewish book.
You know, the example I think of is, what if somebody made a Hebrew translation of the New Testament? So that's in a Jewish language. Most of the authors, you know, were Jewish by background. It was actually aimed at a Jewish audience. You know, the letter to the Hebrews was to the Hebrews. It certainly has Jewish cultural and historical references in it, as they talk about the prophecies of the Hebrew Bible, or what they call the Old Testament, and it's related to Jewish life. On the other hand, it's not accepted as Jewish generally by Jewish communities. So, you know, one of the things we find in this categorization process is there is no one Jewish community, right? So what we might consider as acceptable, others might reject. And what others might accept, we might reject. So I agree that it can certainly be a Jewish book, and we're not the imperialists, you know, banning books from libraries here. But the desire to have a Jewish community accept it may not be essential, because there may be another Jewish community that does accept it, even if one doesn't. After all, people often ask me as a humanistic rabbi, how do other rabbis treat you? And I say, well, some are nice and some are a little dismissive, but on some level, I don't care, because I don't live by their approval. You know, if I lived what they wanted me to do, it wouldn't be my life. And so we get to define our own sense of Jewish literature by our own connections to this writing. Okay, so let's look at number 5. Does it have to be related to Jewish life, to identity or practices or belief? Now, today there are lots of Jewish books being written about Jewish identity, about Jewish practice, about Jewish beliefs. I'm actually helping to edit one right now that will come out probably in a year and a half, given the way the publishing world works. It'll be an anthology of contemporary humanistic Jewish thought. It'll be great to have it out there, but it's one of a gazillion books that are coming out on Jewish thought and identity. And what you find now, even more interestingly, is books aimed at a wider audience, drawing on Jewish sources. So when I was a new parent, the top popular book was a book called The Blessings of a Skinned Knee, which claimed to present wonderful parenting advice, all from Jewish sources. Or there's another one that came out maybe 5 years ago by a woman named Tiffany Schlein, who was the director of a wonderful short documentary called The Tribe, about Jewish identity, and about Barbie dolls. You have to see it to make the connection. But she wrote a book called 24/6, The Power of Unplugging One Day a Week. Now, she's talking about disconnecting from technology and having meditation time, but guess which day she unplugs? It's not Tuesday. It's not Friday. It's Shabbat. It's that 24-hour period. Or another example that I can show you. This is by a rabbi named Danya Rutenberg. Oh, another example, someone asks, is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion a Jewish book? Well, it wasn't a Jewish author, and it certainly wasn't aimed at a Jewish audience, but it does relate to Jewish life. You know, it certainly has Jewish cultural references, but it's never been accepted as Jewish by a Jewish audience. Okay, so let me share another page with you just for a second. This is a book that just came out this year by Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, I'm sorry. It's called On Repentance and Repair, Making Amends in an Unapologetic World. And so she's writing, talking about how American culture wants us to let go of grudges, and survivor communities point out this causes harm because the person hasn't made amends. And so she knew there was a better model rooted in the work of the medieval philosopher Maimonides. And so she elaborates on Maimonides' work, talking about the work of repair that needs to be done before forgiveness is offered. We've talked about this a lot with Yom Kippur and in other settings. So she describes Maimonides has 5 steps, and she can apply this lens to our personal relationships in the wake of Me Too and Native American land rights and sexual harassment and the legacy of slavery and systemic racism. On Repentance and Repair helped us envision a way forward. And the key part is the last paragraph here. Rooted in traditional Jewish concepts, while doggedly accessible and available to people from any or no religious background, On Repentance and Repair is a book for anyone who cares about creating a country and culture that is more whole than the one in which we live, anyone who has been hurt or is struggling to take responsibility for their mistakes. So the point there is, this is Jewish wisdom, but it's good for everybody. It's good for anybody. So it's related to Jewish life in terms of the content and the references, but it's not uniquely aimed at a Jewish audience because she's marketing, right? You're trying to sell it to as many people as you can. And if you're only selling it to a Jewish audience, Jews represent 2% of the American Jewish population, and that's just not enough. So this is, again, directly connecting these books to Jewish identity, Jewish practice, medieval philosopher Maimonides. And notice he was described as medieval philosopher Maimonides, not medieval rabbi Maimonides, which of course he also was. Because if it had been medieval rabbi Maimonides, that might have come across as too niche, too Jewish focused. The goal, again, is the broader applicability. It's like the people who are interested in Kabbalah, right? They don't really care about the original context. It's a Jewish reference point to make their lives better. So what do you think? Is it essential to have a book oriented toward Jewish life, talking about identity, practices, or belief, or could you get by with just the first 4? That if you had a book that's by a Jewish author in a Jewish language with a Jewish audience, and that refers to Jewishness in some way, and has Jewish references or Jewish characters, which is the other part that's hidden by the video window here, is that enough? Or do you need the book to be in some ways directly oriented towards being Jewish, doing Jewish? What do you think?
Some of our most lauded literary authors do all of these, if you count English as a Jewish language. But in terms of the group you listed earlier, and many of the names that are the big hitters in Jewish literature, they're writing about Jewish life, sometimes semi-autobiographically, but it's only very recently have we had big breakout Jewish authors whose works aren't even Jewish allegories.
Right. They have rabbi characters. They have, a bar mitzvah scene. And, I was really struck when I watched the movie version of This Is Where I Leave You by Jonathan Tropper, which is a very fun read, very funny. Although I think he owes Lawrence Kasdan money because he rips off the Big Chill 17 times in his novel, but that's my particular read of it. But what's fascinating about the movie version of the book is that only one of the kids involved in the story, the actor is Jewish. All the other actors are not Jewish. But the writing has de-Judaized the characters to the point that there's no problem with having non-Jewish actors play them. And, that's one of the ways of sort of thinning out the Jewishness of the novel. It's a fun novel. There's a lot of Jewish references in it, and he mentions bar mitzvahs and saying Kaddish and sitting Shiva after somebody's died, and has to explain them, but they're there. And what I find also is interesting about those novels is they're not directed like beating you over the head with this is about Jewish identity, but they are about Jewish identity and about the challenges that we face with it. It's just not, put on, it's like, think about where you'd find it in the Jewish bookshelf. Would it be in the Jewish literature section or in the American literature section that happens to have Jewish characters? Maybe that's one of those dividing lines on, is it oriented directly to Jewish life and practice? Like what Jews believe, that's going to be in a different section than This Is Where I Leave You.
Or Goodbye Columbus.
Or Goodbye Columbus, which again has lots of Jewish cultural, religious references and characters. Yes, Emma, please.
So I have a real problem with thinking that, for example, Carlo Levi, who does not write about Jews, he writes about his experience in Italy in very poor towns, and he's exiled there because of what's going on during World War II, and he is a Jew. But the Jewish thing is not really prominent. The prominence is about lives there and how desperate and how awful they are for people in Italy and where he is, just to get medical care, etc. So, but I have a problem with aiming literature toward just a particular group of people. Why would we want to do that? Don't we want to just tell the world about some of what Jews are about, but not only. It's about people. It's about lives and human beings. And so, categorizing literature as Jewish and having it be so codified that it has to, have certain elements only or mostly or aimed at, I have a real problem with that, because the point is about communication and about expanding people's knowledge of a particular group, but being also inclusive of humanity and what humans have as experiences. And so certainly in the case of Carlo Levi, it's about his experiences. He happens to be exiled there because he's Jewish during World War II, but he writes about what's going on day to day in these towns that are so stricken by poverty.
So a couple of thoughts, Emma. One is, you would certainly call his work Italian literature because it's set in Italy with talking to Italian people. So in the ethnic category of Jewishness, we can have our ethnic literature too. The second thing to think about is, can a Jewish author write a book that isn't Jewish, that's just talking about the human experience? And I would argue yes. So some of Isaac Asimov's work does talk about Jewishness, and some of it does not touch on it at all. And he's allowed to do that. We're allowed to not be our ethnic, cultural, religious identity at all times in everything we do. And the third thing to keep in mind is that when people are choosing to write a novel, they're deciding what the characters are going to be. Right? They give them a name, they have a backstory in mind, they're going to reveal things about their history or who they are through the course of the novel. And one of the choices that many writers make that fit in this category we're talking about is they choose to make the characters Jewish. And if they've chosen to make them Jewish by a name or by an explicit reference, or they say, I don't eat pork because I'm Jewish, or they light Shabbat candles, or there's a gazillion ways you can tease the fact that they're Jewish or reveal it in some way. They've chosen to do that. That steers the narrative in some way. And so if they've chosen to make a character explicitly Jewish, then we have to think about it in terms of why they did that. What does that add or take to? How does that direct the narrative in some way that we need to think about? So I see Cindy and Judy and Larry.
Kind of in a way of answering the question by providing an opposite, relating to Jewish practice, beliefs, experiences, historical references, doesn't make it Jewish either. A while ago, I saw a Twitter thread by a synagogue's librarian who had a whole list of books that she wished people would stop reading, as, you know, thinking of them like as a book about Jewish, you know, people, identity, all of those things. She started with The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, and kind of went through just a long list of books that, even though the Jewish experience was very central to the book, it sets a very incorrect and inaccurate tone, whether it's that, you know, there are non-Jewish people who kind of rush in as the saviors of the day and you know, kind of dismiss the actions of the Jewish community to act for itself and on its own behalf, or whether it's diluting the villainous actions of those who are targeting the Jewish people, the Jewish characters in the book. So I don't know that it has to be about those things in order to make it Jewish, but just because it has those things, that also doesn't make it Jewish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Judy and then Larry.
One of the books that I read now, when you asked at the beginning, isn't a novel, but it's The Diary of Anne Frank. I think is most of those boxes would be checked by The Diary of Anne Frank, if not all of them.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite examples of a work that makes you think about how you characterize just these kind of questions is, of course, Leonard Bernstein's Mass.
Right. I mean, you know, written for a Christian audience. And where does that fit into this panoply of Jewish sources? I mean, the Yiddish writer Sholem Asch was almost excommunicated from the Jewish community because he wrote a couple of novels in Yiddish that were very sympathetic to Jesus and to Paul from the New Testament. One is called The Nazarene, the other is called, I think, The Apostle. And they're actually very good novels. They're sort of historical fiction set in the time and the place. He lands kind of agnostic on the divinity of Jesus question, you know, sort of like Jesus Christ Superstar too. But he was rejected by the Jewish community. How dare you write this? And that's, you know, that was in a period 80 years ago, 100 years ago, where that number 6 was really important. And the fact that it was rejected as Jewish by Jewish communities, even though it was written in a Jewish language, and non-Jews were not reading Yiddish in 1925, so it was clearly aimed at a Jewish audience. It nevertheless didn't qualify. He was rejected because it was beyond the pale. So what does it mean to write for a Jewish audience today? How do we determine that? Well, there are a lot of people out there today who are very interested in Jewish life. You can go to Passover Seders at Christian churches now. There are, as I mentioned, all kinds of people who study Kabbalah mysticism. And don't forget, there are thousands and thousands of spouses of Jews who are not Jewish, but who nevertheless might have interest in Jewish literature and culture because they've married into this cultural background. And even if you went back to the golden age of American Jewish literature with Bellow and Saul and Malamud and Roth and Ozick, they couldn't have only written for Jews. In the 1950s and 60s, Jews were 3 to 4% of the US population. They didn't make bestsellers we didn't make bestsellers all by ourselves. Once you've written a novel in a non-Jewish language, and the Jewish authors have been accepted as American authors, you know, they can write the great American novel, well, then you need to explain what the Kaddish is and what Shiva is in your novel, because you can't assume the audience is going to get the reference or get the joke. You know, listen to an Alan Sherman record and think of the things he doesn't explain, that he just assumes his audience is going to know. That's not the case in Jewish comedy today. You have to explain it because you can't assume people are going to get the jokes. We're not reading in Yiddish anymore outside of the ultra-Orthodox world. And in America, there are very few readers of modern Hebrew literature other than Israeli literature in translation. Look, I loved reading the Yiddish Policeman's Union, which was a wonderful book, funny, and what I especially loved were all the in-jokes, because he included stuff with Yiddish references that he didn't explain, and either you got it or you didn't. So, for example, the slang in this, the novel, just to give you the quick context, the novel imagines that 1 million Jews were saved from the Holocaust by being deported to Alaska, and a small corner of Alaska was set aside as a Jewish autonomous territory. This was actually proposed in Congress in 1940, never got anywhere. But he imagines in an alternate history that this did happen, and the Jews were sent to this place, and 1 million Jews are still there speaking Yiddish in 1985 or whenever the time is set. But the jokes are great. So the slang for a gun in this community is a sholem. What does sholem mean? Sholem is Yiddish for peace. So his joke is either it's a peace, right? Or it's your peacemaker. Like, I'll give you some peace here with my sholem. But he never explains what sholem means. Or there's another part where one character is annoying a second one, and the first one says, "Stop breaking me a teapot." That doesn't make any sense in English, but in Yiddish, "Chak mir nicht kein Chainik" means stop, literally don't break me a teapot, but stop bugging me, leave me alone. But that's the unusual case of a novel like that. And the reason that this novel was successful was there was enough other stuff there. So writing only for a Jewish audience, I don't know if you need that to define it as a Jewish novel, because so many novelists that are writing what we would call a Jewish novel, and I would call Jonathan Tropper's Where I Leave You and Yiddish Policeman's Union Jewish novels, are nevertheless writing to a wider audience. Now, as we touched on the question of a Jewish author, is that enough? Well, that's where it gets tricky, because I don't want to say that everything Isaac Asimov wrote was Jewish literature and everything that Albert Einstein did was Jewish science, because you know who I sound like? I sound like Nazi Germany. You know, that Freud psychology, that's not valid, that's Jewish science. And it's defined by the character of the person who did it, not by the content of the material. So if we claimed everything ever done by Jews as Jewish culture, that would be too broad for me. And it would also feel kind of like ethnic detective-y. Now I want to find out, what's Jewish about the Stephen Sondheim musical? Let's see what I can decipher. Now, he does have a musical called Into the Woods, which is all about like Midrash, telling a story based on a story, but for fairy tales. So that one, you might see some Jewish character in there. But there are plenty of others that have nothing to do with being Jewish. And that's okay. We're allowed to do that too. So to wrap up, I just want to look forward briefly to the future of American Jewish books, which is what I promised with the title of the program. And I see 3 characteristics that will define Jewish literature going forward, in America at least. The first is, it's the experience of Jewish and. Jewish authors now are not simply lumped into Jewish literature or Jewish American literature. They are listed in multiple places, and that's the benefit of the new world we live in. Now, when I grew up and I went to college, we had something called a card catalog. Some of you may remember the card catalog. In the card catalog, you would have one card that would have all the information for the book, because there was one location in the library where you would find that one volume of the book. And if it was cross-referenced by the author or by the genre or by an alternate title or something else, there might be a spare card in that other part of the card catalog. But in the end, there was one main card for the book, and there was one book on one shelf, and that was it. Living in the digital world today, there's cross-listing and hyperlinking. And so you can have a blog post that's linked to from 17 different places, and it doesn't matter how you get there. So Jewish writers today can be Jewish writers and American writers and LGBT writers and women's lit writers and people of color writers. I mean, where does Michael Twitty's book fit? It's American food writing. It's African-American literature. It's Jewish American literature. It's literature of somebody from South Carolina. I mean, there's all kinds of categories you could put in it, and it's all of the above. We have authors of multiple heritages and identities, the children of those intermarried families that are going to write to audiences like them. One of the most popular Jewish young adult books, it's part of the PJ Library series, as I believe, is called My Basmati Bat Mitzvah. It's about a young girl who is both Jewish and Indian, Hindu. And so she's celebrating both of her heritages and dealing with the conflicts of both of her families as she's going through the wedding process. I know lots of people who watch my big fat Greek wedding and say, wow, how Jewish that story was. Because it's the interethnic dynamic that gives it the spice. And so we will have more and more of this Jewish and literature where we won't have to pick Jewish or something else. It's Jewish and many things. The second feature that I think will stay true is that it will respond to the Jewish experience. Whatever we call Jewish literature will respond to the Jewish experience today, not just in the past. And as we change, as we have new experience, our literature will change too. You know, the earliest American Jewish writers in that early 20th century were writing about the immigration experience. Mary Anton's book about coming to America and being an immigrant. Henry Roth's novel from the 1920s, Call It Sleep, is about an immigrant experience and immigrant families and the American-born children grappling with the immigrant experience of their parents, or learning how to acculturate to America, like Saul Bellows' novels of the 1950s. Well, we're going to have different dynamics now. Now, you still get some immigrant stories, like Gary Steingart, for example, who talks about being a Russian Jewish immigrant in the 1980s and 90s. But you'll also get plenty of different dynamics based on the Jewish experience today. More rediscovery of one's Jewish heritage that one's parents or grandparents tried to hide, or the angst at maintaining your separateness, even as you've integrated in many other ways to American life more broadly, or maybe even the questioning of belief. There are wonderful scenes in Jonathan Safran Foer's doorstop of a novel, Here I Am, where the parents of a bar mitzvah kid say, why are we bothering with this bar mitzvah, given that we don't believe in God anyways? What are we doing with it? That's the kind of grappling you might not have had 50 years ago, but you have today because people feel connected and disconnected at the same time, and they're trying to tease it out. So as the Jewish experience changes, so will American Jewish literature. And finally, people sometimes ask, what was the best age for Jewish literature? And they might point to the medieval literature we talked about with Maimonides, or the early modern period with the rise of Hebrew literature and the rise of Yiddish literature and the rise of American English literature, speaking to the Jews and from Jewish voices. But I always draw a parallel to Ken Burns' baseball documentary series. In a later episode of that series, they ask one of these scholars of baseball, when was the best era in baseball? And he says, it has to be now, because any time before now was less inclusive. How could you call it the time of Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig when you had the Negro Leagues and Black people weren't allowed to play baseball with the major leagues? And now you have the global world of Latin American players coming to the United States to play, and players from Korea and Japan coming to play. It has to be the best now because now is the most inclusive. Everyone can participate. And this is true for Jewish literature as well. Today, men and women and everyone else can be rabbis. They can share their wisdom in writing, long form and short, online and in print. I believe in perfect faith with the coming of a new Twitter. Even though it may tarry, there will be a replacement, there will be new genres, and we will continue to create in them. And those authors will be accepted by communities who find their writing speaks to that community. LGBTQ and straight, secular and religious, intermarried and unmarried Jews, they're all part of the Jewish literary world today for the first time. And that means it has to be a golden age because it's the first time we've all been able to speak and be heard, to write and be read. Well, I want to end with an anecdote that's shared in Elie Wiesel's novel, The Gates of the Forest. Elie Wiesel, as you know, is a Holocaust survivor who wrote a memoir called Night and another one called Dawn about the aftermath of the war. He also wrote novels and fiction, and one of them was The Gates of the Forest, and he begins with a famous legend attributed to one of the earliest Rebbes in the Hasidic tradition in which he was raised. In the first generation, when there was a crisis, the Rebbe would go out into the woods, he would light a special fire and recite a special prayer. and the disaster would be averted. In the second generation, the Rebbe knew where to go in the forest and knew how to recite the prayer, but no longer knew how to make the fire. And yet it was sufficient, and the disaster was averted. In the third generation, the Rebbe knew the prayer, but no longer knew the place in the woods and no longer knew how to make the fire. All he could do was recite the prayer, and yet that was sufficient, and the disaster could be averted. And in the fourth generation, the Rebbe of that generation no longer knew the place in the forest, no longer knew how to make the fire, and no longer even remembered the prayer. But he could tell the story. And one hopes that would be sufficient. Wiesel ends his retelling of this story. God created man because he loved stories. We might say, man created God because we love stories.